Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 22 of Series 10. The question for today is, what is truth? Is it an absolute or an anthropocentrically constructed concept? Reading from one of my works, The Pursuit of Value, Chapter 2, Section 3. This series of workshops is about consciousness as a foundation of value, or the will to value as a principle of life. And consciousness is provisionally defined here as all the mental states that we experience. These mental states can be classified as either cognition, affect, will, or value. Yet these different states interpenetrate and interact with each other in complex ways. One of these ways is a relation and even a dialectic between cognition and value. That is, I have proposed that the will to value leads to a certain independence or sufficiency of value. But that sufficiency of value is never completely independent. That is because it always depends on support from cognitive frameworks to some extent. And the effectiveness of that support will further depend on the quality of particular cognitions and their frameworks. That is, cognitive representations like fantasy, fiction, belief, knowledge and truth, as well as the frameworks in which they are presented in such forms as myth, stories and theories, and how they are presented with coherence, consistency, or with sincerity and integrity. These are the context in which we are examining the concept of truth, and we will later look at how interpretations of the concept of truth bear upon our thesis about value. Yet to do that, we will need to examine the concept of truth in a general philosophical context. We did that last week in the context of objectivity and objective knowledge. This week we will focus specifically on the concept of truth itself. The concept of truth has traditionally been regarded as an absolute, somewhat like mathematical axioms, but more recently it has come to be thought of as an anthropocentrically constructed concept. One reason for this has been the consideration of different theories of truth, the most basic of which are the correspondence, coherence and pragmatic theories of truth. But before examining these theories of truth, we need to consider truth as a property and what it is a property of. That is, we must take into account what aspects of the world the truth is being applied to. This is because truth will be applied to different things in different ways. These include physical objects, mental states, propositions, and emotions or feelings. A.J. Ayer, for example, holds that truth or truth values, as in true or false, are not applicable to feelings or emotions. And many thinkers agree that feelings don't imply correspondence, coherence, or pragmatic assessments. That is, they exist as experiences within themselves without such external qualifications, except that when they are authentic or inauthentic expressions of something. For example, William James held that feelings are true when they let us get in touch with ourselves. With respect to the truth of objects, Hegel identified a deeper philosophical sense in which truth is the agreement of some content with itself or of an object with its concept. Hegel gives examples of this sort of truth as a true friend, a true state, and a true work of art. Yet he affirms that truth is usually understood as the agreement of thought and object. Robert Stern has argued that Hegel's deeper truth is close to what Heidegger labelled material truth, namely a property attributed to a thing on the basis of the accordance of that thing with its essence. That is, an object is true if it conforms to the kind of thing that such an object is supposed to be. But these are only provisional notions, and essences are strongly argued to be illegitimate. So on this view, such a concept as of a deeper truth is unacceptable. For such reasons, I also cannot accept Heidegger's truth of being and Sartre's truth of being in itself, unless, that is, these are claims about the fact that being exists or the nature of being. But both these claims are also contentious and certainly not explicit in their original statements. So I also cannot accept the direct ascription of truth to physical or abstract existences. In support of this view, we should observe that there have been a radical change in how truth is conceived. For example, Plato, Descartes and Hegel believed that an absolute conception of truth exists, even though we may or may not ever be able to apprehend what it is. But Bernard Williams' book entitled Descartes argued against such an absolute conception of truth. And before Kant's Copernican revolution, it was thought that truth was a correspondence with reality. This has also been described as a mirror theory of truth or knowledge, criticised by Richard Rorty and others. It has also been well argued in philosophy that some things cannot be attributed with truth values, not only brute existence, emotion and feeling, but also things like art, fashion and games. For example, a chess move isn't true, but can be described as appropriate or good or bad. And moral facts are contentious because morality is largely a matter of intention. This is seen more clearly with the existentialist notion of authenticity. And these are standard views of the application of truth that I hold here. And following the rejection of the truth of existences, we can also reject certain other fallacies about truth. These include the widespread assumption that truth itself will provide a panacea for all problems. And this error is reinforced by the following analysis of theories of truth, that there is no final theory of truth or final truth about anything. But it is sometimes objected that there are facts that are truths about the world, and this is a theory of truth. Yet this fails to distinguish facts from truths and theories of truth from facts and truths. Theories of truth must include explanations and arguments, not just isolated facts and truths. Also, truth is the formal definition of a relation between an object and its supposedly accurate account. But a fact is an informal description of an existing state of affairs. And this definition of a fact coheres with Bernard Williams' view of an everyday notion of truth that we all can't help but use in order to speak about and navigate the world. Also, to help define truth, we can compare it with the idea of objectivity. That is, as already indicated, truth is a relational property or quality in accord with the supposed reality. But objectivity refers to a viewpoint or approach that is thought of as unbiased or impartial. Yet as with truth, objectivity can be understood in many different ways. In my workshop on value, I gave 10 different ways that objectivity can be understood. These were as substantive ontological existence, universality, realist conceptions, and impartiality. Several other obscure meanings include avowals, supervenience, and inescapability. And this variation of meaning further indicates relativity. Yet with that, we can start with a correspondence theory of truth that also faces a number of difficult problems. Two of these are that correspondence theory relies upon an ambiguous relation between statement and fact. That is, as shown by Wittgenstein's complex theory of meaning and other theories, statements or descriptions are relative, variable, and proximate. And as shown in last week's discussion of objectivity and even science, facts are always contingent and open to discovery and interpretation. But correspondence theory of truth is often associated with metaphysical realism that faces many problems. These are problems like it being unlikely that an absolute metaphysical substratum does actually exist. It might be objected that correspondence theory does work in a practical, rough and ready way, but we are seeking philosophical definitions here, not rough and ready answers. Yet the idea of practicality points to a pragmatic theory to be discussed shortly. So not least of these problems are other theories of truth that the correspondence theory has to compete with. And the primary theory competing with correspondence theory is the coherence theory of truth. Coherence theory defines truth in terms of how well things fit together in a view of the world. It thereby avoids the problems of metaphysics and uncertain access to an underlying reality. And a viable application of coherence theory is to logic or mathematics. David Hilbert described mathematics as an avoidance of contradiction. So logic and mathematics are self-validating systems of thought, but physics isn't self-validating. It's an a posteriori system of contingent observations. So the problem with the coherence theory of truth is that it need not take empirical reality into account. And it may have the rational coherence of a madman without reference to empirical fact. But it can be argued that if that coherence is broad enough, it must eventually refer to all facts. And this seems to be what science is doing when working out principles of understanding. But science cannot be taken as the adjudicator of truth because it is pragmatic, value-laden, and it involves subjectivity. And it simply assumes principles such as coherence, reasonableness, simplicity, objectivity, and pragmatism. Yet this leads us to consider a third theory, a pragmatic theory of truth. The pragmatic theory of truth defines truth in terms of what works. An illustration of the pragmatic theory of truth is that science not only provides coherent knowledge about the world, but that it works. My favourite example of how this can happen is a fluid theory of electricity. A fluid theory of electricity was once accepted as true, but it is now known to be false. But it nevertheless works very well as a pragmatic understanding of electricity. That is, volts, amps and watts can be well understood as pressure, volume and the power of liquid. High voltage or pressure, for example, is more likely to spring a leak in either electricity or liquid. And the comparative metaphor between electricity and liquid can be extended in many other ways. This shows how pragmatic, non-realist understanding can work even for science. Last week we showed how creatures with different colour perceptions are able to operate effectively in the world. We also saw how Thomas Kuhn's paradigm theory explained scientific development sociologically. The problem is that, although these pragmatic explanations work for science, they are also effectively false. That is, with hindsight and from a perspective outside of those judgments, they cannot be described as true. Yet this raises a broader question of whether all our judgments are influenced by what works. That is, not just science, but ethics, logic, and even mathematics that avoids contradictions. Even without considering other theories of truth, these three examples already enable us to draw certain inferences that these differences indicate truth isn't a presuppositional absolute, but a subjective human artifact, and choosing any one theory of truth over others requires reference to another or other theories. But such a theory would also require justification, leading back into an infinite regress. Therefore, there is no final theory of truth or final truth about anything. In support of this view, we can reiterate Bernard Williams quoting Donald Davidson last week, saying that truth is, as G.E. Moore, Bertrand Russell and Gottlob Frege maintained, and Alfred Tarski proved, an indefinable concept. Unquote. Thinkers like Kant and Karl Popper can also be unexpectedly referred to again in this respect. This is because they regard truth as a regulative rather than a constitutive or an absolute concept. And Paniel Rees Cardenas finds truth to be a regulative attitude in both Hegel and Kierkegaard. Such difficulties with the main theories of truth has led to some skepticism about truth altogether. This skepticism is found in Simon Blackburn's redundancy theory of truth, also held by Frege and Ramsey. That is, the reference to or invocation of truth adds nothing to our descriptions of the world. For example, to say that it is true that it is raining is the same as saying it is raining. But truth seems to have usefulness in explaining the status of a person's statement rather than its content. And in the forthcoming argument here, truth is a key qualification of a supporting cognitive state. Yet Blackburn continues his deflationary approach to truth with what he calls quasi-realism. Quasi-realism is a form of anti-realism that works to construct a normative framework for the world. The standard description is that quasi-realism earns the right to talk objectively about things. This view can be compared to others and described differently in a way that I prefer. We can, for example, compare it to Wittgenstein's anthropocentricity or Heidegger's being in the world. To both these thinkers, being and acting in the world is essential to constructing the reality of the world. In this way, reality and objectivity is earned or constructed by acting in the world. This is similar to, but a different interpretation of, Blackburn's quasi-realism. And such different interpretations raise certain problems for Blackburn's quasi-realism. For example, quasi-realism could adopt any anti-realist perspective involving contradictory quasi-realisms, and the possibility of contradiction would nullify the advantages of quasi-realism. But anti-realist perspectives fall under the umbrella of anthropocentrism that I describe in terms of consciousness. That is, I've argued that consciousness is the most fundamental way of describing human existence. Yet, as noted, I'm interested in the substantive or ontological significance of truth for consciousness, rather than its epistemological significance, as in Blackburn's case. We can also note that, for Descartes, consciousness was a way of discovering indubitable truth. That is, with his "I think, therefore I am" as the first step in his method of radical doubt. In this paper, I turn the significance of consciousness to truth around into the significance of truth for consciousness. And the significance of truth for consciousness or human life can be seen in the fact that, like morality, truth makes inescapable claims on us that we ought to take up. That is, in a sense more basic than knowledge, we must presuppose truth for every inquiry. In this sense, we ought to pursue the truth, or put another way, affirm the will to truth. But what is it that motivates us to affirm or will the truth? It can't be the sheer conception of the idea of truth alone, as Kant would have it. That is, the motivation can't be purely cognitive or even happiness. And to say that the motivation is volitional is almost tautologous. One answer is found in the synonyms of affirming, willing, or valuing the truth. That is, the truth is lit up by values that motivate us to seek it, and the value of truth is revealed as contingent. But why would willing or affirming the truth have this effect of conferring value? It is because, in one sense, the idea of truth represents the highest objective we can aim at, and the pursuit of that objective thereby reflects value back onto ourselves. Yet the same analysis of value reflected back onto the agent is applicable to both morality and the will to truth. I've argued elsewhere for this analysis of morality as value being reflected back onto the agent, and I would also like to reiterate the fortuitous relations that I cited between morality and truth. That is, they both make obligations on people that seem wrong to resist, and they both provide the highest objectives that we can aim at. Yet they also both involve properties of incompleteness or possibility. To explain one aspect of More's naturalistic fallacy was that the moral good cannot be adequately defined. I disagree that we can't define the character of the moral good, which I do define in terms of value. But I agree that we cannot definitively define either morality or the highest moral good. This is because, like truth, the highest moral good is liable to reformulation and further discovery. Yet more than this, incompleteness provides a possibility of development that beckons us forward. It beckons us forward because improvement is part of a healthy and functioning human nature. This can be explained genetically, as well as part of the structure of consciousness that reflective awareness of what is not known will motivate us to know the unknown. The point here is that, as suggested, truth as a moral value share features of incompleteness and indeterminability, and this comparison of symmetry and truth and moral value leads them to evoking similar kinds of value. This is because values are largely determined by the objects that they value, and truth and morality both provide cognitive frameworks that support value states. This is one way that truth is relevant to consciousness and human life. Yet there is more to say about this symmetry between morality and truth. That is, as previously argued and implied above, ethics isn't an adequate account of moral life, and that the highest moral good can't be defined because it is open to development and further discovery. And we have also seen that truth is an anthropocentrically constructed ideal concept. Morality and the highest moral good are thereby the highest evaluative ideals that we can conceive of and value. And truth is the highest cognitive ideal that we can conceive of and value. But they are both no less representative of our highest ideals and values for that. I also held that the incompleteness and indeterminability of truth rendered it open to possibility and development. Yet this incompleteness and development was presented in cognitivist terms, and it implies other incomplete forms like truth, such as knowledge, belief, fiction and fantasy. We will examine these shortly. But there is another aspect of the incompleteness of truth that is expressed in terms of value, like above. That is, both truth and knowledge have been mistakenly thought of as having intrinsic value. And following this classical view, John Finnis and others hold that knowledge is of intrinsic value. Against this view, Mackey convincingly argues that there are no objective values, and it follows that there are no intrinsic values in the fabric of the world like mind-independent truth. I agree, because values must always be maintained within the mind of a conscious agent. It follows that the value of truth and knowledge is agent-dependent and agent-relative. Yet truth and knowledge cannot have intrinsic value for slightly different reasons. That is, truth isn't a mental state, but is an abstract property of relations between thought and object. Yet knowledge is a mental state, albeit a cognitive state, that might then have intrinsic value. But cognitive states, like knowledge, typically don't have value content in themselves, so if knowledge can't have value content within itself, it also can't have intrinsic value. Interestingly, Williams holds that ethics needs an unconditional will to truth and the intrinsic value of truthfulness. And although he maintains the intrinsic value of truthfulness, he accepts truth has no intrinsic value. He might be able to maintain this view because truthfulness is both a mental state and a good will. And as Kant said, nothing can be conceived in the world which can be called good except a good will, unquote. I agree, because in my view, the only candidates of intrinsic values are mental states and conscious beings, that is, people. Yet the incompleteness of cognitive states of belief, fiction and fantasy can also have positive benefits in life. The most obvious examples are various forms of art that reveal truths about the world in fiction and fantasy. Belief is also a vital component in religion and positive thinking with real-world benefits. That is, belief, fiction and fantasy are incomplete forms that reveal aspects of truth. I have previously argued, for example, that religion is a supporting cognitive framework and a mythological phenomenology that reveals and sustains some of our highest value experiences. In the simplest form, we find the importance of cognition in John's Gospel 20:31, that these things are written so that you will believe that Jesus is the Christ, God's Son, and that believing you will have life in his name. Yet human imperfection and weakness needs such supporting cognitive structures, and those structures themselves are contingent and provisional, whether social, theological or philosophical. Yet the deeper significance of these incomplete forms of cognition is seen in their relation to consciousness and value. Husserl, for example, talks about different modes of perception in desiring, fearing, or in memory or fantasy. And these are the noesis and noema of intentionality and object in Husserl's phenomenology. And truth qualifies the object of intentionality, constituting consciousness and value. Yet on foregoing arguments, my conclusion is that truth isn't an objective or absolute mind-independent ideal. It is nevertheless an anthropocentrically constructed ideal from the best ideas that we can muster. We concluded this from the inadequacies of correspondence, coherence and pragmatic theories of truth, as well as the inadequacy of the concept of truth itself. That is, there can be no final theory of truth or final truth about anything. We also saw that against the classical view, neither truth or knowledge can be attributed with intrinsic value. This is because, as Mackey and others argue, there can be no independent values in the world, and cognitive states like knowledge and properties of truth typically cannot have value content. Yet despite these conclusions, we considered arguments against a redundancy or deflationary theory of truth. One of these that we need to account for the status of a person's statement beyond its material content. And more significantly here, truth is a key qualification of a supporting cognitive state. Yet more than that, we saw that, like morality, truth makes obligations on us that are difficult to resist, and that in a further comparison between morality and truth, there is a symmetry of incompleteness, and that this incompleteness provides a possibility of development that beckons us forward. On this view, truth has a vital part to play in the pursuit of value and the sufficiency or adequacy of value. That is, human finitude and the structure of consciousness dictate that such value states will require supporting cognitive frameworks of the required kind and quality. And that quality can be obtained through qualifications such as truth. So let me have your comments and criticisms at the meeting or on websites like Zoom or meetup.com. The kind of response that I'm looking for is either approbation or some indication of where I am mistaken.